Sarge's response to the news that Nubby's black market deal was about to turn into a shootout was nowhere near as sarcastic as Amy had anticipated. This was because her report was interrupted by Jim and the cogitator adept discovering that the source of all the chatter on the station's net was a massive bounty that had just been placed on all crew members of the Occurrence border by the Astra Telepathica. This worrying news was interrupted in turn by the Diplomacy Adept's report that the Choirmaster had just declared our inquisitorial credentials to be completely falsified, and was in the process of convincing the other station leaders to sick everything they had on us. That last bit of bad news came as a surprise, because we knew that Sarge's rosette was genuine, and there was no way it could have just malfunctioned either. Inquisitorial rosettes and the verification databases are built to last. That meant this wasn't some sort of accident. The Choirmaster had obviously come unhinged and was out for vengeance. I mean, it was sort of understandable. He'd just had his brain half fried by a psychic blast, which had also killed a whole bunch of the closest thing he had to a family. And the whole thing was technically our fault. Justifications aside, though, after he ran our credentials, he must have decided that he didn't like the answer, or he might not have even bothered checking at all. And now he was lying to the other station leaders about how we were all vile heretics impersonating Inquisition agents. They believed him, too. By the time we'd figured out, via the bugs, what was happening, he had the prefect and the president completely convinced. There was obviously no chance of talking the stationers around. All Sarge and the diplomat could do was sit there and listen as they argued about the best way to round all of us up and bring us to justice. The situation was foobar, to say the least, and all this news hit Sarge at once. Now, this is where some men might have gone into shock, or exploded in irrational anger, or sunk into despair. But not Sarge. He allowed himself half-second of ironic satisfaction at the way his cynicism had once again been justified, then removed that stupid inquisitorial hat and started belting out orders. Admittedly, those orders were to just do what we would have done anyway, but as someone or other had said, never give an order that won't be obeyed. So, as a reminder, we were split up into 4 groups. Well, 5 if you count the captain, but when Sarge calmed him to report the situation and coordinate things, the ex-Navy officer just told Sarge to do something anatomically improbable and said he'd meet us back on the ship. Judging by the amount of gunfire and screaming in the background, he had things under control. Anyway, Doc was stuck in the station's security-filled med bay in the mid-north part of the station. Amy and company were in a warehouse on the lower levels of the eastern side of the station. Twitch and the Occurrence border were at the westmost docking bay, and Sarge was almost at the top of the central spire. Our options were limited. We were split up, ass-deep in increasingly hostile territory, and in Sergeant Doc's cases, practically unarmed. We did have a ship full of armsmen, plus a few nearly functional lance batteries, but the stationers knew that and were already deploying men in that direction. We were far too outnumbered, outgunned, and, though it pains me to admit it, ethical, to start an all-out war. Plus, it's a bad idea to blow holes in a space station while you're still on it. They'd have to sit back and hold down the fort while we did our best impression of a bunch of catechins on their way back to base after a night on the town. It was time to fall back on that old guard classic. Regroup, retreat, repeat. The plan, if you could call it that, called for Doc, who was exposed, surrounded, had no idea where Sister Valerie was, and still had his hands quite full with Gravis, to sit tight and hope that no one remembered which closet he'd been shuffled into. Amy, Tink, Nubby, and Fumbles would load up all the loot they could carry, as if they needed telling, make their way to the med bay to collect Doc, and then the whole group would head for the ship. While they traversed the station, Twitch, along with the suicide skulls and any armsmen he could find, would keep the locals out of the docking bay and the occurrence border. As an afterthought, Sarge asked Twitch to try to keep things as non-lethal as possible, on the off chance that we'd have an opportunity to try and smooth things out. It'd be nice not to have a 4-digit body count to deal with. He may have given Amy a similar order, but some freak comm interference, which sounded a lot like Nubby and Fumbles blowing on their comm beads, scrambled the message. Everyone liked the plan except Doc, but it did have one problem. It didn't cover how Sarge would get out of the Astra Telepathica headquarters. We pointed this out, and we were told to shut up, do our jobs, and let Sarge take care of himself. The rest of us interpreted this as a clear sign that Sarge had no idea what he was going to do. But since we didn't have any suggestions more useful than sarcastic comments about handle it, we left him to it. Once the rest of us started moving, Sarge muted his comm bead, swore a lot, then took stock of the situation. He was in a small office and bathroom suite with only one exit, which led to a large conference room. Said room was probably occupied by a few of the choirmaster's bodyguards, who would be watching to make sure he didn't go anywhere while the station leaders plotted their attack. His assets consisted of 1 laser pistol, standard Inquisition issue, 4 laser pistol power packs, charged, 1 combat knife, notched, 1 roll of duct tape, olive green, 1 comm bead, muted, 1 inquisitorial costume with hat, stupid, 1 300-year-old bug-planting diplomat, grumpy, 1 Jim, whimpering in a corner about how everything keeps happening to him. This was not, of course, anywhere near enough to take on the small army of armsmen, gun servitors, and very angry psychers inhabiting the Astra Telepathica, not to mention the station security forces outside. In fact, by Sarge's reckoning, it probably wasn't even enough to take the 6 to 8 bodyguards that the choirmaster had brought with him, but the diplomacy adept disagreed. The aging diplomat drew an ornate las pistol from his robes and suggested taking the station's leadership hostage while they were still only a few rooms away. When Sarge just stared at him, he explained that with sufficient leverage, it'd be easy to reopen negotiations and smooth everything over. After a few more seconds of staring, Sarge decided that nothing the old diplomat did or said would surprise him anymore, and made fight through a bunch of heavily armed men and start a volatile hostage situation Plan B. In a desperate attempt to come up with a Plan A, Sarge reactivated his comm bead and asked the Cogitator Adept to try and find the spire's blueprints, and then began checking if the suite's air vents were large enough to crawl through. Jim, who was huddled in a morose little ball, told Sarge not to bother. It would be incredibly stupid to make air vents large enough to fit a person. Sarge tried to defend his idea by pointing out that the occurrence border was littered with such vents, but Jim patiently explained that this was only because the occurrence border was an incredibly stupid ship. Sarge relented, but in the silence that followed, the Cogitator Adept pointed out that there were a few maintenance shafts on the Telepathica's blueprints that could be crawled through, if Sarge could open them, that is. Jim attempted to shoot this idea down as well, explaining that such shafts would be heavily monitored by the local Mechanicus, who'd report our movements to the station government. Sarge had grown rather cross with Jim by this point, and angrily told the engineer to do something about that, or help him think up a better idea. Jim went quiet at that, then got a really thoughtful look, and went over and jacked himself into the suite's comm terminal. He didn't respond when asked what he was doing, so Sarge assumed it was something important, and decided to focus on keeping the suite secure until Jim finished whatever it was. Way down in the black market warehouse, Amy and Tink put the finishing touches on the cargo pallet. Said pallet looked nothing like the one that had left the occurrence border. For one thing, it was much fuller than it used to be. The stack of crates on it was nearly 3 meters tall, and they were held in place by dozens of straps and tarps. Because this was far more weight than the pallet could handle, or anyone wanted to push, a few grav plates had been scrounged from the warehouse by Nubby, and more or less randomly strapped on. Finally, the treaded bottom half of the warehouse's cargo servitor had been fastened on as an incredibly grisly external motor. The thing looked horrible. With a coat of red paint and a few stubbers, you could pass it off as an orc track. But it handled surprisingly well. The only interruption during the whole loading and modification process had been about a minute after the Marketeer had fled, when the laser turrets in the ceiling had suddenly swiveled to track us, and then went still as the EMP grenades Spot 2.0 had placed on them went off. There'd been no other attempts to kill us, partially because Tink had used his heavily modified plasma gun to weld the warehouse doors shut, but mostly because of fumbles. The hyped-up psyker spent the whole time jittering back and forth in front of the main entrance, emanating all sorts of mental unpleasantness at anyone who got near it. He claimed that after the third time the Ratlings had lost their nerves, they'd decided that since they had all the warehouse's exits covered, they could spare the time to call in a few teams of disposable biggins to tackle the scary guardsmen for them. The major flaw in their plan was that we had the aforementioned heavily modded plasma gun, and no intention of leaving via the doors. After a quick call to the Cogitator Adept to pinpoint a hallway below us, Tink set his plasma gun to cut, and added an exit ramp to the black market warehouse. He did a very good job of it too, managing to pick a section that didn't have any water or sewage pipes and was long enough for the ramp to come down a nice, gentle 20 degrees. Honestly, Tink did such a good job that the Ratlings should have paid us for adding the exit ramp. It was real professional work, and we made sure to point that out in the note. We left a note for the Marketeer because honestly, we felt a little bad about how things had turned out. We really hadn't intended to rip off anyone. I mean, sure, we'd snuck in a psyker, a stealth drone, and enough weapons to kill anyone who argued with us, but that was just reasonable precautions. We'd had every intention of playing things straight with them, or at least only moderately crooked. The point is, we understood that their attempt to betray us was because of the whole telepathica thing, not something personal, and Nubby really wanted to keep doing business with them after this was all cleared up. So, while Tink worked, Nubby put together a little note explaining how there were no hard feelings, and that we were only taking a reasonable 73% trying to kill us penalty. It should be noted that this rather precise percentage wasn't some arcane black market custom. It was just the amount of stuff we were able to fit onto the pallet. Anyway, the penalty took the form of a few things that Jim had been intending to get from the Administratum, plus a few of our own crates. At Amy's insistence, these did not include the damned, literally in this case, servitor control units, or any of the other stuff Nubby had kept in the Cogtane crater room. Those would be someone else's problem. When Tink was finished, we taped the note to what was left of the cargo servitor, gathered up fumbles, and got the hell out of there. Our trip through the station was shockingly swift, stealthy, and professional. At least for certain values of stealthy and professional. But there's no debating the swift part, or the shocking part for that matter, since our dismembered servitor propulsion system was capable of pushing the loot pallet at speeds best described as unsafe. We piled onto it and sped through the corridors like a bunch of drunken guardsmen on leave. Thanks to the maps provided by the Cogitator Adept, the scouting abilities of Spot the Wonder Drone, and a plasma gun-enabled disregard for inconveniently placed doors and walls, we took a very direct and underpopulated route to the medbay. That's not to say we didn't run into anyone on our trip, but thanks to Spot and Fumbles, we generally saw them before they saw us. We managed to avoid or sneak by a few potential witnesses, as well as some mercs and security officers. Others were handled by sucker punches and the application of Tink's not actually a power weapon power wrench. When that wasn't an option, we had Fumbles cloak us, or edit a few memories, though sometimes this didn't work either, and a more efficient approach was called for. Violence was only our last resort, mind you. It's not like we were some sort of high-speed murder barge shooting down the station's corridors with no regard for collateral damage, innocent lives, or speed limits. At least not most of the time. Anyway, if you disregard maimings, psychic trauma, property damage, and other little things like that, our expedition was practically bloodless. Which is to say that there were definitely under 10 deaths. And most of those were mercs and bounty hunters, and everyone knows they don't really count. Oh, and the maintenance worker that got ran over by the loot pallet really should have known to look both ways before entering such a long and obstruction-free corridor, and had probably been drunk anyway. Despite the incredible speed of the loot pallet, we reached the medbay considerably behind station security. This was hardly surprising, though. They'd had several teams guarding the place since it was currently home to half the station's surviving astropaths. Luckily, Doc was a big boy who could look after himself, and had kept the rest of us up to date on his situation while we traveled. Doc's initial situation had been about as bad as Sarge's. The stationers knew he was in the medbay. He had nothing but his sidearm, and there was no way he could get Gravis out without him being noticed. Some of us had suggested leaving the torsified space marine behind and hoping the stationers treated him, but Doc wouldn't have it. So Doc was stuck in a medbay filled with angry station security goons. Luckily, it was a big medbay with lots of hallways, rooms, and people running around doing stuff that was much more important than helping station security. Doc was fairly confident it would take a while for them to find him, especially since he'd plastered the storage room's door with biohazard and quarantine stickers. Really, the only problem Doc had with this situation was that Sister Valerie still hadn't come back. He wasn't too worried since anyone who attacked a sister hospitalier in the middle of a packed medical facility would suddenly find themselves in the middle of a lynch mob. It was still a bad situation, though. She really needed to be in the loop on the whole "the head of the local telepathica is nuts, so we're leaving" thing. After cursing at himself for a while and promising that next time he'd give her a comm bead, Doc sent his 2 assisting nurses, who were practically indistinguishable from the stationer's staff, out to find Valerie while he took care of Gravis and the life support machinery himself. A few minutes later, the first nurse came back with 2 station security guards in tow. Doc was not amused.